Thank you. All right, do we have I think we have some remarks before we're going to get to the panel. Is that correct? Okay, I'm gonna just have you, if you don't mind, just come up and introduce yourself.
Good morning, assembled crowd. My name is Kingsmill Bond, and I work for Carbon Tracker, and I believe my role here, well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I believe my role at this gathering is to set the scene for the discussion. And so what I plan to do is to lay out the global context, and then just explain where Southeast Asia fits into that context. So starting with the first slide. So the global context, as if we move, the global context, I think, for this energy discussion, we always need to remember is that at heart, this is a technology revolution. This energy transition, it's a collapse of, it's driven by a collapse in the costs of these new energy technologies of solar and wind and batteries, and now green hydrogen electrolyzers. That therefore, next slide, please, means that, again, as we know, renewables have become the cheapest energy source in 90% of the world. And right across the world, you now have either solar or wind as the cheapest energy source. The eagle-eyed amongst you will spot the fact that Southeast Asia, most notably in this BNEF chart, is one of the very few areas in the world where it's not yet the case, but certain areas of Southeast Asia. But in fact, the answer to this one simply is just a question of time. There's a very interesting piece of analysis done by Oxford University, which suggests that, or makes the argument that the countries which are in the top 10% most expensive today will be the same price as the cheapest 10% in 10 years. So the point to me is that it's just a question of time. Next slide, please. Furthermore, as this Oxford, actually the one before that, as this Oxford paper makes clear, these cost falls are inexorable and quantifiable. So that is to say, we have these technologies on learning curves of between 16 and 34%. Every doubling of deployment means that your costs are going to continue to fall. It always feels very difficult when you're inside the system. I know, but listening to people yesterday talking about margin compression and cost and how hard it is. But rest assured, well, as we all know, it was exactly the same thing 10 years ago. I remember people saying to me, for example, when solar panels were $2 a watt, we can never get below $2, and here we are now at 20 cents. And the point to me is, it is always very hard, but innovation has continued, and I think will continue. So that sets the scene for continuous cost falls. Furthermore, renewables are, of course, enormous and universal. We did this piece of Carbon Tracker just looking, actually, thanks to my friends at GWEC for giving me a lot of the data to provide this analysis. We looked across the world at the size of renewable energy. And the point to me is that we have 100 times as much renewable energy resources as our global energy demand. And it's very, it's of course right across the world. We sort of split the world up into 4 regions, and you can see, or 4 groups, you can see that right across the emerging markets, particularly obviously in sub-Saharan Africa, there's enormous renewable resource compared to current energy demand. Next slide, please. And as a result of all this cheapness and universal nature, renewables are on these S-curves. And again, it's sort of hard often when you're inside the industry to take possibly the bigger picture, but these are S-curves, and what happens in S-curves is you just keep on moving very, very quickly. On the exponential growth continues, and the kind of rule of thumb is that you go from 5% market share. It takes a very, very long time to get to 5% market share, but then you move from 5% to 80% incredibly fast. And of course, we're now basically at 5%. So it's a very exciting moment, I think, right across the renewables universe. Next slide, please. And what that then means is a global electricity system change. This is quite an interesting chart. I think this is data from Rystad for the global electricity sector. And you sort of might miss fossil fuels because that's where they are. They are dominant now, but are going to get completely pushed out of the system really quite quickly. Next slide, please. There are then very significant benefits from that shift for local, previous one actually, sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, I know I put my own little slide in. I'm sorry. There are very major benefits for local jobs as a result of that shift. Okay. I'm not going to speak for too long. That, I think, is the global context. I'm now just very briefly for 2 or 3 minutes going to set out what this means for, or how Southeast Asia fits into this context. Thank you. So as you all know, Southeast Asia is unusual. It has got a very fossil fuel heavy electricity system currently. Fossil fuels make up between 34% and 97% of the electricity system. And furthermore, unlike most other countries and regions, solar and wind, according to at least BP data for 2020, a relatively small share, sorry, 2019, a relatively small share of the system, between 0 and 4% of electricity generation versus 10% globally. So Southeast Asia, on the one hand, is, as I say, very fossil fuel intensive. However, of course, and some might see this as a source of weakness, but in fact, I see this as a source of opportunity, because as Vietnam has shown us, if you start from very low base, it's actually very easy to implement huge amounts of renewables quite quickly, and you don't run up against the ceiling of deployment feasibility, because you can really copy the lessons of the leaders anyway. So that's one observation. Next slide, please. Furthermore, Southeast Asia is unusual because electricity demand per capita obviously is relatively low in the global context. If the global average is 3.5 megawatt hours per person, there are many countries in Southeast Asia where it's below 1. And that again creates a very different dynamic to what we see in many other countries. You have a huge amount of growth. And of course, the glory of growth is that you don't have to retire existing assets, which is the kind of problem which is faced in many developed markets, where it's a fight to retire existing assets. If you have growth, then all of the growth can come from renewables. Next slide, please. The other general observation to be made about Southeast Asia is that, with the obvious exception of Indonesia, and Fabio will talk more about this, most countries are, of course, fossil fuel importers. And again, as we've said in Carbon Track, and if you're a major fossil fuel importer, such as Thailand, or India for that matter, it has a very material impact upon your balance of payments. And it actually creates a very fragile environment. So therefore, there's a very powerful incentive for those countries to use their own local domestic resources. Next slide, please. Furthermore, again, as you will appreciate, there are huge pollution issues. So this is data from a recent paper by Vora looking at the share of deaths attributable to fossil fuels. It's absolutely appalling. In this region, between 10 and 20% of deaths can be attributed to fossil fuels. Again, another factor which is obviously likely to encourage governments to embrace change. And then maybe the final point to be made is that these regions have enormous renewable resources. So this is the map I showed earlier for the world. If you look then specifically at Southeast Asia, Indonesia has 100 times as much renewable energy resources as its current energy demand, but the whole region is very renewable rich. So if you do this chart, for example, for Europe, you'll see there's a series of countries, but it's only about 10. The UK, the number is about 15. And it's really hard for us because that's why we have to go offshore. But for Southeast Asia, most countries you can see in this chart are above 50. There's a huge amount of renewable resources which can be exploited. Just a couple of final points before I hand over to the panel. And again, this is really to set the scene. I take data here from BNEF at costs. So as we mentioned earlier, Southeast Asia hasn't yet quite got to a situation where its costs are dramatically lower, but it's about to get there. So this kind of sets the scene that, according to BNEF, you already have costs of solar and wind, which are sort of comparable with those of fossil fuels. And then next slide. But of course, as we see in other countries which are deploying renewables faster, such as India and China, these low costs will come. This has been projections for the future. But the point simply is that that we're trying to illustrate in this chart is that in these countries, the cost of solar and wind have become not merely cheaper than fossil fuels for new, but actually cheaper than existing fossil fuels, which means they start to push existing fossil fuels out of the system. So it becomes a very different debate. Final slide, I think. So I almost debated to myself whether I should even put this slide in, because this is a very global slide. But what should one be doing now under these circumstances where you have a series of technologies which are universal, potentially considerably cheaper. And just in broad terms, I think it's worth noting that the lessons from other countries: you set targets, you amend policy regimes, you put into place auction systems, you use the international development banks to tap into global capital markets, lower costs, you plan for flexibility, digitization and localization from a start, and then you can deploy. And I guess the point to me is that this is the kind of the playbook from many other countries, many other regions. And what I imagined, well, like what we can see now, Southeast Asian countries taking advantage of this new opportunity. So I shall stop there. I hope that's a sufficient scene-setting introduction. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I will just move your mic. All right, so we'll start with the panel discussion now. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Tracy Crow. I'm a Senior Director and Chief of Staff at Sustainable Energy for All. If you're not familiar with SE for All, I have to do just a little plug. So we are an international organization working in partnership with the UN, private sector, other stakeholders, working to accelerate the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And also working towards energy transitions in line with the Paris Agreement. So that is our reason for existence. So it's very appropriate, I think, to be here today to talk about wind and renewables more broadly, and their role in the energy transition to come. So let me introduce our panelists. We have here in person with us is Fabi Tamiwa. And Fabi, if you could just maybe join me on stage up here. And Fabi is the Executive Director, Institute for Essential Services Reform. And then joining us virtually, we have Marty Senthavanarong, Vice President, International Business Development, Gulf Energy Development. And I think we also have Nhan Ngo, Executive Director, Vietnam Institute for Energy Transition Social Enterprise. Oh, and we will have Nhan soon. So, all right. So starting with an initial question. So we are still in the middle of a pandemic, unfortunately. At SE for All, we released last year Recover Better guides, and these are guides about recovering better. As governments, as economies start to put in place stimulus plans and so forth, how do we take advantage of that? How can Southeast Asian countries take advantage of that to recover better, particularly with an investment in sustainable energy? So, Marty, if I can start with you, if you don't mind, but how are you seeing the recovery play out in Southeast Asian nations? And this investment in renewables, how can governments invest in renewables to recover better?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. So the observations show that in general, the governments need to promote wind and other renewables, perhaps relax regulations, such as timing commitments, because we are still recovering from COVID-19, and resource movements are taking longer than usual. Okay, that's one thing. And the second thing I'd like to share is from the Thai government, they've been very supportive in wind and renewable energy development. For example, they've created many BOI benefits for these types of projects. So we appreciate that, certainly. Thank you.
Fabi, how about from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of governments investing in sustainable energy, or the opportunity to invest to recover better?
Well, that it has to be like that. But in Indonesia case, I think we failed to do so, and I think there's a number of reports that evaluate how the Indonesia spend the recovery money, and I think it's very small it actually linked to the energy transition or support renewable energy. But I think it can be understandable from the point that government priority, like, because when the crisis happens, the government reaction, it's to save the power purchasing, save small business, and save a state-owned enterprise from collapsing. And for instance, in Indonesia case, the government then decide to make the poor consumers free electricity. They because according to the government evaluations that this is poor households is actually suffer so much from the drop of income because the loss of their job. There's no income, and then with that, then the government say, okay, so you get free of electricity, so you don't have to pay. That measure is actually still continue until mid of this year, where the governments then introduce, like, they start paying but only 50%. But that's still that measure still remain until the end of this year. So that's and if you look at the number, is $1 trillion rupiah. I think is around what the subsidy, what the allocated for that, I think is around $3 to $4 billion. Well, it can be spent for supporting renewable energy. But again, I think the perceptions of crisis and priority is different country by countries.
So looking at what's going on at COP26 here, and there's been a lot of announcements transitioning away from coal, investments in renewable energy. Are you expecting any difference coming out of this? Is this a motivator for governments to, if they haven't already, to invest in wind and solar and other renewables? Is there enough data now and evidence to back that investment, showing that you've got an increase in jobs, you've got an increase in economic opportunity by doing that? But do these announcements help? Marty, let me start with you.
Sure. I think that, all the countries are transitioning into, wind and other renewables, and as well as the other technologies. So, depending on the country, they're all learning, which is the one that fits their specific country the best, given, current COVID situation, economic resources and other measures of support from relative governments. So we'll have to see where it keeps going.
Think you'll see coming out of COP26?
Yeah, I think it's very strong that we have to do energy transitions, and this decade is very, very important. I think it's reflect in the number of priorities, and I can say that for Indonesia situations that the government realized that we have to ramp up our renewable energy capacity in the next few years, to be aligned with, to meet the policy target. We have the policy to set renewable energy 23% mix by 2025, and later on, as a part of our journey toward decarbonizations, which has already announced 2060 or sooner, then we have to increase renewable energy quite rapidly. I think according to our calculation, that renewable energy mix has to be around 35 to 40% of the total energy mix of Indonesia for the power capacity, power generation in 2030, right? So if we look at that, what is very important is that investment. I think the government realize now, as they are moving toward net zero emission target, and they have to ramping up renewable energy in the next decades. What very important is actually investment, and that's always a questions, because in the past, country like Indonesia is look at the investment of renewable energy, we sort of target and that makes renewable energy capacity growth very, very slow in the past. But I think now, as many countries shifting their investment from coal and fossil to renewable, you see that hopefully there will surge of investment. And I think now it depends on the country how they going to tap that investment, improving the regulatory framework, investment framework, clarity in the target, remove all the implementation barriers to attract this investment. But for Indonesia, I believe that's the priority. And also, as our government already stated that they are exercising to early phase out coal in the before 2030. So it means that the require for renewable energy capacity to be added into that system in our energy system is even higher right now, and that's the investment required is enormous actually.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 23% target for ASEAN nations. What has happened? We're 19 months or so into a pandemic. What has happened to that target? What is the impact to that target? Is it still achievable?
I cannot say for increase from
Can the ASEAN Marty, can you hear me?
Okay,
From
I can
you
hear you.
on the we've got. Yeah.
Sorry, I can hear you.
So Marty, the question was whether you thought the ASEAN nations could meet the 23% renewable target from I think the interruption from COVID-19. Is that still achievable?
Well, from what I see, COVID-19 has not impacted to the extent of making the goal unachievable, but I suppose that it has slowed down some work because of all the resources that need to be gathered. I think to achieve this goal, in the next years coming up, we just need closer collaboration, not only between governments and private sector players, but also among private sector themselves. Okay, for example, between developers and EPC, turbine suppliers, we just need to all work together and get on the same page. And I think that will help everybody move forward expeditedly. Thank you.
So we're hearing here at COP26 quite a bit about just energy transitions. We've heard the announcements, the commitments about transitioning away from coal. But what does that mean? How do we do that in a just way? What does that mean from your perspective, and what's needed in order to really be able to do an energy transition in a just and equitable way? Fabi.
Well, in Indonesia cases, the implications, well, since, I mean, Indonesia, as Kingsmill mentioned, is not just the consumer of coal. We are one of the largest coal producers and exporter. Actually, we are the second largest coal exporter in the world after Australia. 80%, we produce like around 650 million ton coal every year, and 80% actually for export. We only use 20% for domestic use. So looking at this energy transition, this is that countries are now plan to reduce the coal capacities, phase out coal power plant. That would be the shift in the next 5-10 years, right? So the energy transition in Indonesia context, if we look from the coal producers as a coal producing country, is that what is the implication for the companies that coal mining company, but also very important is that the government, the impact to government revenue, in particular local government revenues and we have done some study in Indonesia, in particular Indonesia context. We have seen that some local government have a high dependency on coal revenue. For instance, one province, the revenue from coal is around 30 to 35% annually. So you can imagine in the near future when the coal price drop or when the production of coal drop, there's a big impact. And we have seen that. I mean, during 2014, 2017, where the coal price is below $50 per ton, the economic growth of these provinces is actually declining, and the number of poverty increase, and all the sectors that related to the coal business is actually decline as well. So we see that impact. So the question for energy transition, how actually is not only about the worker, but more like economic transformation for those provinces which currently rely on coal revenues. Yeah. So, and also if we look at these provinces in Indonesia, there are 4 provinces that produce 80-85% of coal, right? The poverty level is actually high, and the level of education is actually very, very low. So it's very challenging. You see, in the 1 decade to really transform the quality of life, and the electricity consumption in those provinces is actually average low. So you see that the transition is the just transition is not just about workers, but I think if you look closer in the coal context in Indonesia specifically, it's about economic transformations, green economic transformation, create job, create new revenue sources for local government, so they can spend on infrastructure, health, education, and create new jobs. So it's not easy, and increase build quality electricity infrastructure for better energy access, because those actually they don't consume a lot of electricity because of the poverty, but also the reliability of electricity infrastructure in those areas are very, very poor.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think, the issue of how do you localize the opportunity? If you're transitioning from coal or other fossil fuels to renewables, it's not always in that same community that those jobs will take place. What are you seeing in Indonesia? Is there a way to try to localize the opportunity?
Well, it's still a question. I mean, we have done in ISR, we have done this research. We have not yet figured out what we can do, but for sure, what we see that we should develop new economic activities there, and that's questions actually when we want to bring now as a renewable replace coal, right? And we know the different, it is very different industries. It's a different skill set that requires. So we have to find something that based on the local resources and the local capacities, and later on think of the new industry that could be built. Well, looking at potential for the agricultural processing, or well, those area, those provinces also depend so much on palm oil, and palm oil is not sustainable either, right? So they are actually locked into this high emission economic activities, both coal and palm oil. So there is no easy answers for say. I mean, we are still doing some studies to look at, but what is the effective or recommendation we can provide? But for sure, the question that we asked, that can we build, for instance, solar manufacture facility there or wind manufacture facility there, and like training centers for people to be for coal miners to be retraining. We say it's not easy. It's not as simple as that, right? So that's what the conversation that we had with the local government.
Yeah, it's not easy.
There is no easy
anywhere.
Sure.
So Marty, the same question to you and your perspective. How do we do a just energy transition, or what are you seeing in terms of trying to localize opportunities and create a just energy transition?
Well, in Thailand, the majority of the power mix is natural gas, but the country's been adding more renewable energy into the mix. For us at Gulf, we've never done anything with coal, so we started our company with gas to power, and we are definitely moving into renewable energy. For example, our offshore wind project in Germany, right, Borkum Riffin 2. And then, of course, Vietnam right behind me, that's nearshore wind. So, I think everybody's getting there. It is a transition, though. So that's the way to go.
So speaking of the wind turbine behind you, so let's just transition directly, nice shot. So there's a lot of excitement on wind, onshore and certainly offshore. So what's driving that excitement? What's going on, particularly Marty, where you are and what you're seeing? What's exciting about the wind industry?
Well, I think because of COP26 and other activities, the world has set their net zero goals, which really prompted developers to put their focus on renewable energy. Okay, add to that, the technology development has really caught up, right, as mentioned before, also in the presentation. So the development costs have come down, which increased the potential of large-scale offshore wind. And I think the scale is what's attracting everybody. Okay, both countries that want to get cleaner and lower cost energy, as well as the developers that are finding the opportunities to participate and help everybody.
So Bobby, any perspective on wind? What are you seeing with wind in Indonesia?
Indonesia wind is it's infant right now. I think the total capacity is less than 200 megawatts. Although the potential, I think, is, well, not big, but it's quite significant. We have done some resource analysis looking at the potential of wind, and we have published 2 weeks ago, I think, in our website, just to look at what is actually the onshore wind potentials, technical potential, basically of 50 meters and 100 meters, and we came with the numbers like from 18 to like 100 gigawatt. If you look at this, so the technical potential is there. We haven't included the offshore wind. But the technical potential is there. But again, the wind is very challenging because of it has to be site specific, right? And where the demands are is not always where the wind wind resources are abundant. And that's, I think, determine the economic of scales. And also the grid infrastructures is quite costly because you have to bring 100 kilometers to demand centers. And that actually one of the issues that hamper wind development in Indonesia. And also when you look at the investment cost in Indonesia, I think is still quite high. And that translated into the latest project, which I understand is like 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And I think that's above the average electricity generations tariff, the electricity tariff of PLN. And so as a utility, PLN quite hesitant to absorb more wind because then it will eat up their margin and it will increase the electricity tariff, which electricity generation costs, and later on the tariff, which also it's become politically challenging when it comes to that. So that's unless that barrier could be removed, the technology, the capital costs lower. So PLN, the project can generate electricity below the product, the average generation cost. That I think wind will be very challenging to be developed.
All right. I think we have an opportunity to take online questions. I don't know that we've got any coming in yet, but I just wanted to just say that we can. So encourage anybody who's watching to send in questions. And I've got one more for both of you. I mean, you talk about the challenges of wind in Indonesia, challenges overall, but what are the policy and regulatory challenges to increasing not just wind, but solar, all the renewables? And what are the challenges, and what are the things that you think need to happen to increase the share of renewables? Marty.
Okay, so the observations for Southeast Asia are it's finding the suitable location or land, then taking into the account the ownership regulations and land rights, right, including clear regulation on the enforceability. So I'm sure that many of these countries are working on regulations that will support the increase of wind and renewables. I think that it is a transition, as we keep reiterating this. So it's going to take time, but they're all working on it to get the goal achieved.
We from government, we need the policies in place. We need the regulatory frameworks in place to send a signal to the private sector. We know that government can't do this alone. It's got to be driven by the private sector primarily, but they need those signals through the policies and the regulatory frameworks. So Marty, just as a follow-up, is there any particular policies or regulations that you see missing in any particular countries, that key ones that you see that are just instrumental in really getting things moving?
Well, I think that maybe the governments should try to consider making the laws, regulations a little more flexible, because we look at this whole project as a partnership between the government and private sector. Okay, it's a requirement that we partner up to achieve the goal, right? We can't have one without the other, I suppose. So we're always working with the government as best as possible. Also, if the governments can relax project timelines, given the COVID situation in different countries, that would probably be also helpful to the private sector.
Fabi?
Well, I think there's a couple layers of challenge and barriers. But if we look at, one is the perceptions about wind and solar, which for utilities also, and also for the government, majority of the government, they see this as intermittent. When it comes to intermittent, it means like unreliable, costly. So and it's for solar and wind in Indonesia. Situations couldn't develop because, well, it is intermittent. It cannot not provide firm power, and therefore it's difficult for utility to manage. So given that the current developed technology, and I think the technical issue can be resolved in Europe, for instance, or in the other country, but not in Indonesia. I think that's also related to the capacities and the experience dealing with managing the intermittent power. Well, I remember that when the CDRAP, that's a wind power wind project in South Sulawesi, and it's connected to the Sulawesi system, came online a few years ago. It will took almost 2 years for PLN to adjust their operation system. And during that time, is actually PLN claimed that the average system cost is actually increased because they have to deal with the intermittency of the wind, and that makes with the CDRAP project, and then another project coming in, and I think once they are able to change the way the system operation in that particular in Sulawesi system, they get more confidence. But during that time, because of this bad experience, because PLN have to spend more, they have to pay more to maintain the reliability of the grid. It's become like trauma for them to absorb more intermittent renewable. As the result, then they halt all the procurement for intermittent power, because so now I think the situation resolved, and we can see that more intermittent power renewables, intermittent renewables, solar and wind into that pipeline as a pipeline project. So but that's actually the experience. The second, of course, from the investment perspective, policy and regulation matters. And as I mentioned, the wind is very infant in Indonesia. Wind developer see Indonesia regulation as quite problematic. Well, when it comes to the some regulation for the electricity tariff, for instance, which is that very much controlled by the government, and the monopolistic market of the utility of the state-owned enterprise utilities. It seems as quite problematic, right? I mean, and this is as risky, and also the term and condition of the power purchase agreement that seen also make the project less bankable or hardly to be bankable is seen as the barriers. So when it comes to the implementations, also like here, the issue like land acquisitions, the transmission availability, it's always the issue. So all of that challenging, but I think now both the regulators, both the government and the utilities actually learn how to resolve this matter, and we hope things are improved in the near future. And you can see the first start, as I mentioned, that you have more wind and solar actually in the next 10 years electricity expansion plan. I think wind is around, if I'm not mistaken, around 1 gigawatt. So it's the biggest ever since before it's only 100 megawatts. Now it's like 1 gigawatt. It's a big save, but I think in the near future it could be increased more, because this 10 years capacity expansion plan is updated, not fixed.
All right, sounds promising at least. Yeah. All right, I don't think we have any virtual questions, but just any.
My name is Rebecca Williams, and I'm from GWEC, but also from Renewable UK, the UK Renewables Association. Sorry, Marty. Hi. I just wonder if we're missing a bit of a trick here, because the conversation that we've had is really focused in on getting power, building renewables, but are we in Southeast Asian countries kind of taking people with us on this wider energy system change journey? We focused in on producing electricity, and I think we all know that that's kind of the first step in changing your economy to be more decarbonized. But should we instead be trying to talk to the public about, the wider energy system change that we're expecting, how their lives will change for the better when we have a more sustainable economy versus the economy we have right now. Thoughts from the panel?
Well, that's a novel ideas, I think, but that kind of the conversation that they have to meet the reality. What is the reality matters for public? It's the cheaper electricity and cheaper and reliable electricity. Well, I can say the sad things is that, well, I think I can tell in Indonesia context, people doesn't matter whether the electricity come from coal or from renewable, as long as they can pay for it, and if possible to get it for free, right? So it doesn't really matters of that. I mean, talk to that renewable is good, you can save the climate. They don't really feel it. I think that conversation is for, well, I don't say even middle class, not really bother with that, but I mean, some part of the community that really aware, understand about the issues, and they want to push for the change and work with this cause, the climate change as a cause. But general public doesn't really, it's not really matter where your energy come from. What they actually, so any energy systems that could deliver reliable and cheap electricity is what they favor. So that's, I think, the energy transition debate. It's pretty much it's quite difficult, and the lesson, the current electricity and energy crisis in the Europe caused by the natural gas is actually resonate quite. I mean, interpreted quite differently of people in Indonesia. They see this as a failure of energy transition, not as and then there's a question whether when we start our journey toward more renewable energy, whether we will have the same impact as what the Europeans actually currently having. So that's a big question.
But can you turn that around? Can you change that perception though, and the renewables actually create more stability in pricing? That the prices are coming down.
But we don't have the experience that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can say that because in the Europe, the penetration of renewable energy, intermittent power is there, and you have the system, right? And people can learn. But we don't really have that in Southeast Asia. I think there is no country in the South Asia that renewable energy penetration below higher than 15%, right? And you have this intermittent power really. So I mean, there is really a big questions about this reliability issue. So I think that could be the discussion that we can have later on. But right now, I think that's what make people worries, the realities that they see.
Marty, let me let you jump in here on this question as well and see if you've got a perspective.
Yeah, so at our company, we want to provide safe and reliable energy. That's one of our goals here. Having said that, I agree with the audience member that public awareness on sustainability in the future is very important, and in Thailand it's increasing. Many of the companies in Thailand have promoted and are working on sustainability issues in their company. So it's going in all the industries. So it's a good thing.
I think we've got one more question in the back here. If we can get a mic back to him.
Hello, my name's Chit Chong from Green Economics Institute. Just a general point. We talk a lot about just transition, but should we not also think about the existing justice? I mean, you were talking about how the greatest coal producing state had the poorest local authorities and the poorest workforce. Isn't that an indication of existing injustice? And so perhaps that should be factored into the thinking of a just transition towards the renewable energy. And also there's the point of and it's a general question. Southeast Asia is one of the vulnerable areas to climate change. Should not the nations have some responsibility for the climate change that they are in the market for? In the case of, say, Indonesia in selling, being a major coal exporter, in the case of Malaysia in being a major oil exporter, there is some responsibility and a party to climate change, a liability, national and commercial liability that can come about in any future, I suppose, climate Nuremberg trials, and also weaken the hand of Malaysia and Indonesia in asking developed countries for money for that transition because they are part of the problem.
All right. Any reaction? It's a challenge, and I think I think that's just a thought that we all want to think about and walk away with, and that's something that everybody is discussing, I think, here at COP26. I'm not sure there's a clear answer, that we're all still trying to work on that one.
Yeah, but I think we understand this is the phenomena called Dutch disease, right? I mean, Dutch disease is the phenomena where the country that produce natural resources and actually sell international market or trade international market is actually very poor because of there's some structural problem like corruption, for instance, or unjust wealth distributions issue. So I want to say that the reason why some province that produce coal in Indonesia poor, well, it's not just because of the climate change, and the reason why they shift the economy from agriculture based to mining, and then become very dominant in their economy because of the demand of demand of coal from the international markets, and I think that works in any commodities, not just coal. If there is a demand, well, the supply will come as long as the resource available. But I think I do agree that it's responsibility for the country to make sure that people to address the poverty issues and use the revenue from this natural resources extraction for the betterment of the people. It's not idle. I mean, not always ideal. Because of the lack of the capacities, bad governance, corruptions, which I think is very rampant in all resource-rich countries, right? And that's what we have to address. So it's not just, from the climate justice per se, but I think and there's also questions when you have renewable energy that based on technology and free natural resources. Actually, you don't extract what light on the ground, that it will change. But again, the poverty, the impoverishment because of that unjust natural resource extraction won't go away, even though you have wind power or solar power in that province. So it's very systemic, and I think the approach is not as simple as what you have mentioned, just get the compensation, but we have to find a way how to address this issue specifically with the local context.
Marty, do you want to jump in with a reaction as well?
I just have a quick and short comment, I suppose. I think in Thailand, we're doing the best that we can. We're adding more and more renewable energy into the country's energy mix. So, the technology allows us to make such transition to a more renewable mix, quicker and globally. Okay. So again, we are all doing the best that we can.
Question particularly for Marty. I know you've been looking at the Power Development Plan number 8 in Vietnam, and the latest version, because it still hasn't been finalized, did have an increase in coal burn, but the Vietnamese Prime Minister announced on Monday at COP that net zero will not be 2070, but 2050. So what do you think that will do to the Power Development Plan number 8, or perhaps hope it will do to the plan?
I think that question, unfortunately, oh, sorry. I will have to defer that to our Vietnam team, and they're not on the call right now, but we will let you know.
A brief closing thoughts from each of you. If you want people here to just walk away with one thing, one major point that you want to make, what would it be? Marty, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that, again, to summarize all the points that we've been discussing, this is a transition that the private sector and the government, ideally would be, partners into trying to achieve the goals as quickly as possible and to meet the goal. So if we can kind of look at the situation like that, I think everybody is going to end up as a win-win situation for everybody on both sides.
Well, we are in the I say that in the situations where renewable is not the alternative, right? I mean, we talk about renewable until 10 years ago is called alternative energy. Right now, I think it's the primary energy. You can say it's no longer alternative. So there's a big shift, I think, in the government attitudes toward renewable energy, the perceptions about risk. I don't know about the industry, but I think the industries has to use this opportunity also in terms of change the way they calculate the risk. And we see that technology innovation is very, very fast right now, and find a way to deploy also renewable energy. So the thing is that the industry and investor always looking at the enabling environments, right? And there is a limit, I think, in enabling environment to be created. Depends on the jurisdictions of the capacity of the administration. So until, my message is that if you won't find any ideal situations, but sometimes you just have to take that risk. And I think fine tune that along the journey for the country like Indonesia, that when is very infant is very, very important, because if you find the right conditions that like you have in Europe or in US, you will not find that in Southeast Asia. If you look at Vietnam, but you have seen that now the governments no longer see renewable as alternative, but as a primary sources as we move toward energy transition.
Okay. Take the risk, partnerships, and I think changing the perception of the risk. Maybe three points to end on. Thank you both. This has been a pleasure to have this conversation. And Alistair, do you want to provide closing remarks?
Thank you. Very kind. Thank you, Marty. Thank you very much. Fabi as well, and to Tracy. So thank you to all of you who've come to listen to what we had to say about Southeast Asia. And thank you to those online as well. So we'll bring this to a close. It sounds that we've got great optimism from Kingsmill that the prices are down. It's almost inevitable, but actually the journey is going to be quite difficult, and it's going to need governments, system operator, and the public to really bring this all through together. Thank you very much.